everyone, welcome to the 14 Wins podcast. This is Bones, and with us is Ram X.
Hey everybody.
Hey Ram, and in this episode we are going to continue on the origins of the UFO phenomenon concerning the Cryptoterrestrials. But before we enter that discussion, we want to talk about what happened in DC last week.
Yeah, wow, what a crazy week with these hearings. And David Grush appeared on the floor along with two pilots, David Fravor and Ryan Graves. And they all talked about some of their experiences, as well as David Grush gave more information about what he had encountered in his intelligence analysis. And I thought the biggest surprise of the hearing was that there was this duplicate version of my Congress that suddenly decided to behave like adults.
Right.
Oh my gosh.
Very bipartisan. It's very rare to see.
It was so refreshing to see all these people who, some of whom have extreme views in that room, and in other circumstances have been all about grabbing the spotlight and the news blips.
Right.
But in that room, everyone was sober and serious and carrying on the discussion insightfully. I just couldn't have been more impressed with the group of people that were there. There was only one moment where there was a representative from North Carolina, Miss Fox, who kind of went off the rails, and everyone just ignored her, which was great.
Right.
I don't think that Congress needs to be going off the rails and making this partisan right now, because this is about their power. This is about whether or not Congress continues to have their power. And if the military intelligence, because the military intelligence complex already has a huge outsized interest in lobbying.
Yeah, good point.
Right? Through lobbying, they can install people that are favorable to them. And John McCain explained how some of this stuff worked. And he said NRA lobbyists will come in and buy GOP congressmen. Sure, he said, but what you don't understand is that they also buy the other side. They also buy Democratic congressmen. And on those days, those people don't show up for the vote. So on that day, the NRA rigged both sides. I mean, McCain was kind of giving up the game. That's to an extent how things work. Nothing's ever the single answer to how government works, but to a big extent, lobbying has an outsized interest.
Now, I was following it a little bit. I heard some news that there were supposed to be other speakers, though, that didn't show up. Was that because of pressure from the Department of Defense?
Yeah, at one point, the number that Congressman Burchett had gave was 6, and he said 3 of them had backed out.
Oh, was that many? Okay, jeez.
Yeah, and I think that at one point the number was even bigger. But that doesn't mean that those people didn't give their testimony in a classified setting. We really don't know how many of people have given their information out at this point. But one thing we do know is that the government version of LinkedIn was putting out some posts from people from a security organization, one of these perception management offices, which is an American word for propaganda. We're all learning through this process. Right. And so this perception management office was putting out something basically telling people that no matter what, they couldn't be protected as whistleblowers. In my words, I'm paraphrasing that, but it leaked out, and so they're trying to suppress whistleblowers at this point. They're trying to stop leaks. We really don't know how big these programs are. And Grush said something during that hearing that he unfortunately, and I don't think intentionally, was cut off about, but Jared Moskowitz had asked him how some of these programs work. And at one point he started to say self-funding. Oh. And I would be very curious, and I'm sure Congress is looking into this, but I'd be very curious to hear, how are these programs self-funding? I mean, there are things like Iran-Contra affair. There's things like, where you're selling weapons. At this point, you're talking about UFO technology.
Yeah. You're talking about private money then.
Right. And he also said that these programs were being run by government in and outs.
Right.
Government in and outs. Super important. And I hope journalists will grab onto that. Because
that's what lobbyists are, in a sense, right?
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so are these lobbyists? But they can also be technologists or scientists. So what they could be doing is giving themselves the UFO technology to a third party contractor while
Right.
they're in government, going back and working for that third. And this kind of stuff does happen, but it also happens in the nature of the business. But this sounds like a flagrant abuse, and they could be giving themselves this UFO technology, then going back out in the public sector and selling it and
Right.
lying to us about it.
Right.
And
Yeah, there's
from
no oversight.
there's no oversight. And Leslie Keane is reporting that the cover up is actually costing more than the research itself. So we're spending more of our tax dollars lying
Right.
to ourselves about this than actually researching it.
Right.
These things, I like to do this as a thought exercise. Let's just say that these things did turn out to be peaceful space bros, and they said, "Hey, we were just here to take away some, rare diseases. You're welcome. Now we're going to leave you alone forever." We would still have to figure all of this part out. This is this part is there's a segment of the military intelligence community that has run away from Congress.
Yeah. Right. Good point.
And if
It's pretty scary.
pretty scary. And if they're self-funding, what are we dealing with here? So these are the questions I hope journalists dig into. These are the questions I hope Congress really takes seriously. And it was refreshing to see them act serious about this, because I think that they understand this. They're saying, look, if these end up being Russian and Chinese drones, all of this stuff is still really bad.
Right.
And Grush brought up people being killed in this. These things have nothing to do with flying saucers. These things have everything with abuses of power.
Right. Well, with that, one of the things that Grush said, and I just can't get it out of my mind, is that when he described when there were, it was above 40,000 feet, he described a dark gray or black cube surrounded by a clear sphere. Now, I don't know if that ties in with, we want to go into the crypto-terrestrial discussion, but that just sticks in my head. I can't stop envisioning that. What's your take on that?
Well, we have an article on the site that I think has a pretty good theory on that, which is, so that sphere that's surrounding it and the fact that it looks like glass is what we would expect to see if there's a vacuum surrounding the object. And
Okay.
that would explain by whatever's in the craft isn't being torn apart by the pressure that's being applied, and it wouldn't experience the same g-forces whatever's outside of it. So whatever's in there could be sipping a cup of tea while it's doing 30,000 miles an hour.
Right.
So that's I think that's the going theory about the sphere, and then therefore that, like, in that case, that object is not aerodynamic.
Right.
So that object could be whatever shape you want it to be in that case. And maybe in the case of these aerodynamic objects, the same means of propulsion is being generated, but those aerodynamic looks are for a different reason. And it could be because they're adapted to certain pressures of outer space or pressures from underwater.
Right. Deep sea. And
And-
that goes into our crypto-terrestrial.
Right, I found a seg.
There you go. Segue.
So aquatic is falls right in. So cryptoterrestrial. What are we talking about here? We're talking about the idea that this is a species that is from here.
Right.
And you and I had to discuss this prior to this episode, and we had to go, okay, are we going to include any sort of interdimensionality in this? And I think we decided that if you do that, it gets really fuzzy.
Yep.
So we're going to say this is some other physical species that is maybe similar to us in some way, that lives alongside of us and has for time immemorial. And there's a book about this, which I think is probably the best work on the subject. And that's Mac Tawney's The Cryptoterrestrials, where the theory tends to derive its name.
Yeah, definitely.
I would say that's on my top 5 books of phenomenon-related literature.
Yeah, it's superbly written. I love that book.
It's intelligently written, and what I like about Tawny's, and we'll get into Keel later, but what I like about Tawny's is that he had the same view as Keel, that you can't form a definite opinion about what this phenomenon is. Did you get that sense from him?
Yeah, for sure. The whole book is more like a discussion of ideas, and he doesn't turn away from anything that may contradict any of his theories. He basically just says the more perspective we get on the topic, the better.
Great point. I think he was a big fan of not cherry picking data. And we see a lot of that in the UFO research community where if you don't like it, you just throw it out. You say this case never happened.
Right.
If you think they're all this species and that species, then and they didn't show up looking like that species, you go, that case never happened, or it
Oh,
was
sure.
this other species that was disguising itself like this species. I mean, people have gotten really dramatic with the soap opera that's going on around us. But
Yeah, you see that in academia. I mean, especially like in the fields like archaeology, when a new dig finds something that can destroy a timeline that someone has been researching and been published multiple times, and suddenly something new comes up, and they just completely deny it because it will destroy their past work.
oh yeah,
I mean, or
that
they think
happens
it
in
will.
history
Yeah.
all the time. There's such a resistance to change because you go, oh gosh, this is a foundational change.
Right.
I think the best example of that, and this kind of falls into the cryptoterrestrial study, which is, how long back does civilization go?
Right.
And for many years, and maybe even today, you'll still find many people who say Mesopotamia and Sumer. Well, there's Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and that's
Right.
9,000 years old on the top level. It's built on top of other layers. We don't even know how many layers it goes down, and we don't even know how old that site is.
Right. Right.
So if you consider things like structure and architecture, I don't think that they've confirmed that there's been agriculture at Göbekli Tepe yet, but it
Oh.
seems to me like they had to eat something. They were there for a long time, but
Well, that's the disruptive part about it, I think, is because it's one of the first settlements that doesn't have any remnants of agriculture.
that's
So,
disruptive totally. And then you have to explain what happened in between 9,000 BC and 6,000 BC at least.
right.
So this concept of how far back our civilization goes, the answer is we don't know. And it's good for us. It's not good for us to set limits there, I think.
Right.
Academically, that's just my opinion. It's not good for us to say, yeah, we definitely started. Okay, we started 12,000 years ago. We have no idea,
Right.
and so we don't know what came before us, and that's a big part of the crypto-terrestrial hypothesis. Is, well, this may be a species that predated us, or it may be a civilization that occurred before us.
Right.
And if that civilization occurred before us, they may be coming here from the past, or they may be still here.
Right.
And who knows how long they live. When these ideas first get mentioned, they sound a little crazy. And I think Tawny's mentions that in the book. He's like, it sounds like you're saying a bunch of cave people are popping out and,
Right.
acting like aliens.
Right.
But he brings up some pretty convincing arguments that there's something here. I would point to things in our research as well as what Tawny's brings up. And in our research, I'll start, which is frequency. They're here
Frequency.
all the time.
Yeah.
As I like to say in the website, they're either from here or they should be paying taxes because they're here all the time.
Right.
I would also point out that when they're seen in space, presumably, and in some cases have been reported by astronauts, and those are difficult to confirm because of NDAs and whatnot. But there's a good deal of evidence that astronauts have seen some things in space. And when they're seen in space, they're seen in near orbit. If they were seen on the moon, that's a hop, skip, and a jump for these things. They don't seem to be bothered by pressure.
Right.
So, and they go 40,000 miles an hour. Going to the
Right.
moon's no big deal. So, this could be a civilization that lives here or is from here and has branched out and is going out there in the galaxy.
Right.
There's another theory I'll bring up. This is a wild thought, but there's a theory called dark forest, which is that there's always something bigger out there. And that would explain why whatever's here keeps quiet. Because we're just a bunch of dumb monkeys, and if something else comes by that's scarier than whatever is bothering us, and if we
Right.
start talking about it, whatever else will know it's here. Interesting theory. It does sort of fit the facts. I don't think we've heard from these things so in an honest way, so we would have no way of knowing without talking to them.
Okay, so what if it was just another human civilization that came here and is just like us?
Yeah, that's I think one of the concepts is a breakaway civilization. So
Breakaway, right?
there was a human civilization that was here previously, and they figured out, like we had discussed on previous podcasts, maybe they figured out, and it does look like this, that they figured out some sort of fundamental force that we haven't. Like we figured out electricity, they figured out something else. And then that informed their technology. They didn't need wires, they didn't need combustion, because
Right.
that would inform their technology. In which case, in some ways, they wouldn't be as advanced as us. They wouldn't have to be. Maybe they would be capable of being, but it would require going to our schools, etc. So, is that possible? Based on the evidence and the trends we saw, yes, I think it is.
Yeah.
It is possible because there's something, and this is what I would say is a trend that both Tani's noted and that we note is all over the place, and we don't know what to do with it yet because we end up seeing some interdimensional stuff happening, but we don't know what to do with this piece of information, but it's always present. And this is why we can't cherry pick data, because it sort of violates everything else that we've talked about. And that's that this phenomenon interacts with us on a very human level, with a very human understanding. There's an example that I would bring up from Skinwalker Ranch where it hid these bulls that the ranchers thought was their prize bulls. They hid them in this tiny little trailer because they had just said earlier that day that if the bulls were gone, that they would feel like they'd lose the ranch.
Right.
So it was messing with them. It didn't kill the bulls. They found the bulls in a trance in the trailer, but it was messing with them.
Right.
And we found a number of cases like this where there's an alien abduction case called Carl Higson where there's a lot of evidence, and he was dropped off miles away from his truck. Supposedly they flew him thousands of miles away in the galaxy, and he was dropped off miles away from his truck. Like, it sounds like humans being jerks.
Right. Right. Pranksters. Huh?
Pranksters. I guess you can call it pranksters, but there's a certain meanness, right? There's a certain almost malevolence to it, where it doesn't cross the line into killing, except in very rare instances where we did find some instances where I would say humans look like they had been killed by the phenomenon, and not just radiation, like actual mutilation.
Wow.
So, there's only a couple that we found that were, I think, difficult to explain. We haven't even done a write-up on those yet, but that it's there, and I think Grush has maybe mentioned some of that or something to that effect. So characterize all of that as being different factions too of a whatever species, even an extraterrestrial species or a cryptoterrestrial species, where there may be different factions and they feel differently about our species.
Right.
And some sort of treaty is in place that keeps them from going to war, as long as they don't violate it too much. And that's why it only gets violated occasionally. That makes a lot of sense. And it actually makes a lot of sense with our religious folklore. That's a prevalent story in not just the Christian Bible, but a number of religious texts. Two sides. And usually we define good as someone who is good towards us, good towards each other, right? Good towards humans. So, the good could be this one faction that is protective of humanity, and the other is destructive.
Right.
So that's an interesting theory, and that also aligns with what we're talking about, because that would explain why the secrecy and engagement. That could fall under cryptoterrestrial or extraterrestrial.
So how about that? The other idea about it being just one big hybridization program by the cryptoterrestrials.
Yeah, it could absolutely be something where a species is genetically impoverished, is the word that comes up a lot, where
Right.
they've been here a long time maybe, and their immune system has become weaker over time, and they need us for immunity or any number of things, organ. And that's interesting. And it's also the cryptoterrestrial phenomenon seems to become more interesting when you consider the genetic component to this phenomenon. And we talk a lot about that in the abductions, and we talk about that in the case of the hitchhiker effect, where there is a genetic component to this phenomenon. If you see a UFO, your family is more likely to see a UFO. Your grandparents were more likely to have seen a UFO. Paranormal experiences run in families. So there's a genetic component here that points to some very ancient connection between us and this phenomenon. And that maybe they're extraterrestrials and we came here from somewhere else and they brought us here, and that's why we have this connection. But where does cryptoterrestrial phenomenon begin and extraterrestrial start? So
Right.
there's also a connection to ancient sites. There's tons of UFOs seen over places like Stonehenge, Nan Madol in Micronesia, the pyramids in Giza. There's a lot of connection to ancient cultures, and certainly in ancient cultures folklore, we see things all the time that we go, well, that could be the phenomenon.
Yeah. Even tunnels. I mean, even there's some folklore when it comes to people coming from the ground, from deep tunnels.
Yeah, that's a big one. The subterranean hypothesis.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence that supports that. I just never know if that means there's bases underneath the earth, or if they live there.
Yeah. I think the ones in Cusco, Peru, they just put giant stone slabs over them and just wanted to forget all about them. So they're completely sealed.
I don't blame them. I think that once you realize, and it's an interesting concept, right? I mean, to seal up the phenomenon.
Right.
In some ways, you wonder if that's what happened, like the Council of Nicaea, in the case of the church, in the Catholic Church, the Council of Nicaea, and I think it was 350 AD. They basically pared down all the books of the Bible and began what we know today as the New Testament and the Old Testament of the Bible. And the previous versions of the Bible were all over the place, and there's a lot of books that didn't make that cut. And there was a lot of mysticism in Christianity for its first 300, 400 years.
Yeah.
And then, Constantine took over Rome, and they needed a religion that could take control. So this was it.
Right.
And they sort of got rid of that mysticism. And it just reminds me of that. I wonder if they were trying to seal this phenomenon up, because people were having contact with it, apparently, in ancient times. And this is where consciousness studies get involved. Maybe there's a belief that it's through shamanistic practices or meditation, some sort of transcendental state where these some sort of contact between whatever this phenomenon is and us happens. But that's a prevalent theory in phenomenology.
I recall you mentioning the presence of hieroglyphics, right?
Yeah, there were some hieroglyphics on both the Rendlesham Forest case and the Zamora case and others. Those two are pretty big cases that people can look up right off the bat. But there were hieroglyphics on those craft, and that's completely weird to me.
Yeah.
So that sort of lends itself to this cryptoterrestrial phenomenon. And one of the theories that involves cryptoterrestrials is the idea that they were a precursor civilization to us. Maybe they were human or something like human. And then they helped us get out of the jungle, for lack of a better term.
Right.
It's a theory that Graham Hancock seems to hold pretty close. He's a journalist who studies alternative ideas around history. And he's got a pretty good series on Netflix called Ancient Apocalypse. But he has some interesting ideas. And one of his ideas is that there's this consistent thread of folklore in native cultures that a civilization someone came along and taught them how to do all these things. And it does kind of match up well with our human history in terms of where we were at the end of the Younger Dryas period and how we got out of the jungle and when civilization looked like it began. It sort of looks like it began out of nowhere.
Right, and you have certain innovations that happen all around the world kind of around the same time also. Agriculture being one of them.
Right. So these hieroglyphics either point to something that is cryptoterrestrial or an ET phenomenon that's related to us, because we use hieroglyphics too. What are the odds we're using the same alphabet?
Right.
Now we'll talk about it in the interdimensional portion next, but Vallée and Keel thought maybe this phenomenon would just do things like that to mess with us, put hieroglyphics on the side of the craft. I find it interesting that the CIA tried to cover up what that Zamora craft hieroglyphic looked like. For whatever reason, they tried to obscure what it looked like. Not the fact that it was on there, they tried to obscure what he described.
Well, I mean, maybe it was just a teenage alien that put some graphics on his cool new craft, just like you'd see. Put some decals on the back. And
Right. So if that's the case, why would we do the same thing? What are the odds?
Yeah, right.
I mean, you used to have that Camaro and the mullet. What was that? It's on the side to say you can't touch this?
Yeah, right. All right, well, that just wraps up pretty much that episode. That was I know we can talk about that forever. It's one of my favorite topics. One thing I know I think it's rumor still, but there's talk of the Vatican making some kind of statement soon. I know we mentioned the Vatican before because of the what was it, the World War II remains.
That's right.
Yeah.
So there's a bunch of pressure on them right now to reveal what's in their archives, because now people know that they know about UFOs, and they've known for a long time.
Yeah.
So that's pretty crazy. I think Catholics now have accepted that the Pope wasn't always being completely forthright. We can't say, right? We can't say he was lying. I don't know. Maybe some of them have. I'm not going to go back and look at what they've said, but there's some clearing up to do there.
There's some there for sure. And hopefully, I don't know if it's going to be anytime soon, but hopefully between now and our next podcast, we can have something to talk about when it comes to that.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I have a feeling that the Vatican's library is going to go back a long way.
Oh, yeah.
And that's pretty, maybe that's a good way to end this. Is I think there, as tension about this phenomenon gets higher, I know that some influencers are saying that this phenomenon is going to make an appearance I don't know. We don't know. We've heard those rumors too.
Right.
And it's possible that this phenomenon said that and then it may not show up. So
Right.
there's also that. But whatever this is, it's been around a long time. That much we
Right.
can be sure of. And that should give us all a little bit of comfort.
Right. That's true.
As we see people absorb this idea, it's funny to see the people that I'm starting to realize are just never going to have an ontological shock. They're just, I mean, the craft could land right in front of them and they'd turn around
Right.
and be like, yeah,
Whatever.
What's the score of the game? And
Me,
you
I
know,
can't-
God bless them.
Yeah. I can't get the picture out of my head of a cube encircled by a sphere, clear sphere. So that's going to be in my mind for a long time.
That's so. Yeah, I even the people that turn away, I think at some point this is going to grab you, because it is big, and we'll talk about it. But yeah, Cryptoterrestrials is a possibility. Definitely check out Mac Tani's book, The Cryptoterrestrials. Excellent piece of work.
Definitely. So, all right, our next episode will be on the interdimensional theories on the topic, and there's so much to talk about. I look forward to it all. Thanks a lot, Rob.
You as well. Thanks, folks.